During the Aleutian Islands campaign, American and Canadian forces sought to repel a Japanese invasion of these islands, located south of the Bering Sea between Alaska and Russia. This campaign was the only major invasion of U.S. territory during the war, and the first since the War of 1812. These islands held significant strategic value due to their ability to control Pacific transportation routes and act as a base for air attacks against the Alaskan mainland and the west coast of the U.S. Military historians have conjectured that the Japanese attack on the Aleutians was a diversion intended to draw the U.S. fleet out from Midway Atoll during the Battle of Midway. However, others believe that it was simply an attempt by the Japanese to protect their northern flank and not at all related to the battle. The initial Japanese plan was to send a contingent of 2 aircraft carriers and supporting ships to conduct an air raid against the American base at Dutch Harbor, then assault the island of Adak before sailing westward to act as a reserve for 2 additional landings on the islands of Attu and Kiska. Their plan was to begin the invasion by June 1, 1942. However, U.S. intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes, so American leadership learned about the size of the attacking force and their strategy by May 21st. The initial response of the American forces was to send out reconnaissance aircraft in order to locate the Japanese fleet and destroy their aircraft carriers. The fleet was spotted on June 2nd, but bad weather set in and further airstrikes could not be carried out. Given that there was no American airbase within 600 miles of Dutch Harbor, it was a sitting duck for a Japanese attack. On June 3rd, Japanese torpedo bombers flew out to attack the base. Only half of the squadron managed to reach the target, with the rest becoming lost in darkness and fog. Those 17 planes were surprised by heavy anti-aircraft fire and American fighter planes near the base, so they hastily dropped their bombs and did little damage overall. The Japanese forces returned to attack Dutch Harbor on June 4th with better preparation and organization. They were able to set fire to oil storage tanks, damage a barrack ship, and partially destroy the hospital. American pilots spotted the Japanese carriers later that day, but lost contact with them due to bad weather. However, this weather also caused the Japanese to cancel their plans for invading the island of Adak. The Japanese occupations of Attu and Kiska on June 6th and 7th were a shock to the American public, as this was the first time that the mainland United States had been invaded since the War of 1812. Many feared that the Japanese would use the islands as a base to attack cities along the west coast of the United States, as so far in the war the Japanese had been virtually unstoppable in the Pacific, and had launched several surprise attacks on major territories. The first retaliatory action that U.S. forces took was to establish an airbase on Adak Island and begin strikes against Japanese positions on Kiska. Kiska was the main harbor for Japanese ships during the campaign, and several were sunk there. On July 5, 1942, the U.S. submarine Growler sank a Japanese destroyer and heavily damaged 2 others. 10 days later, the sub Grunion sunk 2 Japanese patrol craft. However, action in the Aleutian Islands generally quieted until the spring of 1943. In March of 1943, the U.S. leadership learned of a Japanese attempt to send a supply convoy to their forces in the Aleutians. A U.S. force consisting of 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers was sent to prevent this. On the early morning of March 27th, the American warships intercepted the convoy about 180 miles west of Attu and 100 miles south of the Komandorski Islands. The Japanese forces significantly outgunned the American squadron with 2 more cruisers. The U.S. cruiser Salt Lake City suffered heavy damage, and the Japanese forces appeared on the edge of victory. They retreated due to a lack of information about the damage they had inflicted and concerns about American aircraft that might arrive. This essentially amounted to a defeat for the Japanese, as they could no longer use surface ships to reinforce their positions in the Aleutians and instead had to revert to submarines. The next stage of the campaign came in May of 1943, when American forces conducted amphibious landings on Attu in order to recapture it. On May 11th, around 15,000 soldiers landed on Attu. The Japanese forces on the island had not chosen to defend the landing areas, but instead retreated to the rugged terrain of the island's hills. U.S. forces struggled to dislodge the defenders from these positions, despite a heavy naval bombardment before the landings. They also had to overcome poor equipment, cold weather, and booby traps. However, after 2 weeks of heavy fighting, the Japanese soldiers were pushed back into a small area near Shishagawa Harbor. On May 21st and 22nd, the Japanese began assembling a large fleet in Tokyo Bay consisting of 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, and 25 ships in all. This fleet planned to depart for the Aleutian Islands in order to repel the American recapture of Attu, but the island had been taken back before they left. Given that the Japanese forces had no hope of rescue, on May 29th they led a suicidal banzai charge against the American positions, which broke through the front lines and resulted in heavy hand-to-hand combat. Almost all of the Japanese soldiers were killed, which effectively ended the battle for control of the island. The final act of the Aleutian Islands campaign came on August 15, 1943, when American and Canadian forces landed on Kiska Island. However, Japanese tactical planners had realized that it was no longer defensible and evacuated the island on July 28th. The U.S. and Canadian forces a friendly fire incident which left 32 dead after a Canadian soldier accidentally shot at the U.S. positions, mistaking them for Japanese ones. The Allied advance was also slowed by time bombs, mines, and booby traps. Plans were created for attacking northern Japan after the conclusion of fighting the Aleutians, but they were never acted upon. The Aleutian Islands campaign also marked the first time that Canadian draftees were sent to a combat zone in World War II. One final event of significance that occurred during the campaign was the capture of a nearly intact Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter aircraft. The Zero was the primary Japanese fighter used during the war and proved to be a menace to American aircraft during the early stages of the war. However, on June 4th, as part of the second raid on Dutch Harbor, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's Zero was damaged and he was forced to crash land on Akutan Island. Koga was killed instantly. However, the Zero survived the landing nearly intact. On July 10th, an American reconnaissance aircraft spotted the wreckage. After several salvage attempts, the Zero was loaded onto a barge and then shipped to Seattle, where it was restored to flying condition. American scientists were then able to study it and conduct flight tests with it. These experiments gave American pilots important information about the Zero's handling characteristics and tactics that could be used against it, which helped to tip the balance of the war in the Pacific.